My name is David Terry. I am a project coordinator for the Mountain Plains Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. And a couple housekeeping items. Please remember to mute yourself. We are recording today's session that will be available for later viewing on the MHTTC website. And then if you have a question for Dr. McLean as we're going along, please feel free to drop that into the chat box. I will be sharing several links related to today's training, including where you can go to download slides from today's training. So we'll be using that throughout today's session. And if you are a social media user, please feel free to follow us on Twitter or Facebook. Those are our social media tags. And we also have today's webinar being live tweeted on Twitter. So please feel free to join us there. And the Mountain Plains Mental Health Technology Transfer Center is located at the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks, North Dakota. We provide training and technical assistance on evidence-based practices to mental health providers in Region 8, which includes North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. And we are funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. And we are a collaborative grant co-hosted by the University of North Dakota, as well as the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, also known as WICHE. And here's just a brief disclaimer about today's training. This is really just saying that today's training has the views of Dr. Andy McLean and do not officially reflect the position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. If you have any other questions, please feel free to let me know.
Greetings everyone. My name is Thomasine Heitkamp and I'm the co-director of the Mountain Plains Technology Transfer Center. And I just want to welcome everyone to the session today. As we all know, this is a very timely session. And I also want to thank Dr. Andy McLean for agreeing to do this session. He's a technical trainer, an expert on disasters, a psychiatrist, has his master's in public health, and has done work in this area and can share some kind of common themes that we all need to think about as we maneuver through these difficult times with the coronavirus. So thanks, Andy, for offering this training. Welcome, Dr. McLean, and welcome to you all. Thanks so much.
So this is a slide set that's pretty packed and, and pretty busy. It originally was developed for disasters, primarily natural disasters, but there are many similarities with pandemics and many similar lessons to learn, similar resources. So we want to go ahead with that. A couple of qualifiers. My lighting in my room sometimes goes off because of motion sensors. So if you see me get up and go wildly like that, it's nothing to be concerned about other than my lights need to go back on. Also, this slide set sometimes times out and moves on to another set, and so I will need to sometimes move back. Just to review, the phases of disaster as pertains to mental health will be part of this. Discussing risk communication, which is very important as well. And then review protective and risk factors of both individuals and communities in phases of disaster. So just a reminder, the phases of disaster response have to do with mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And we're past the mitigation stage for, pandemic. And there has been some preparedness that continues to go on, but we're primarily in the response stage right now. And as you know, it's a moving target. Every day there are new recommendations, data, and that's actually part of what we see in fast-moving situations like this. This is a slide that has to do with research on natural disasters. And we can, make some sense of it in terms of also pandemics. But think of Hurricane Katrina, think of flooding, think of fires. Oftentimes we have some warning and then there's a response. So in natural disasters, oftentimes we see communities kind of rally and there's a heroic response. And this is from Myers and Zunan's work. And then once we're into that response, and then oftentimes right after, there's a sense of people looking around and then saying, gosh, this should have been done differently, this should have been done differently, and a phase of what they call disillusionment. And then gradually communities build back. An example, back in 1997, in our area, there was a major flood in one of our cities in Grand Forks, and it was the largest pre-Katrina evacuation in US history. And it took a number of years to build the infrastructure back, but they've been able to bounce back quite well. And we'll talk a little bit about both individual and community resilience. These timeframes are an example. It can be very compressed, it can be very expanded, depending on the particular occurrence. So just a reminder about community. I always like this, the root of the word community actually is essentially the gift of togetherness. And when we think about communities, we can think about our own cities, we can think about states, we can think about our gym club or our place of worship. And we're actually members of a number of different communities. So as we talk about community in terms of resilience, we'll keep that in mind. So community resilience, according to Betty Pfefferbaum and her colleagues, has to do with the ability of community members to take meaningful, deliberate, collective action to remedy the impact of a problem, including the ability to interpret the environment, intervene, and move on. So as you can see from this, it's not a passive sort of response. It's actually quite active, that there's meaningful, deliberate, collective action that takes place, which is really important in terms of people feeling that there's something that they can do to make things better. Fran Norris has done a lot of work in terms of looking at communities that have been resilient, that have been strong, been able to move through disasters. There are a number of different traits that are similar among these communities. And one is strong civic leadership. And so again, when we define communities, it can be small, it can be large, but one of the qualities is a strong leadership and an ability to engage their citizens. And so as we talk about risk communication further down the line here, you can see how important trust is, how important it is to be informing people of what's happening, making sure that you are engaging them, drawing them in, having them part of the solution and not pointing fingers. Resources and the use of resources, particularly in terms of times where there are limits, is also a trait of a very strong community and a resilient community, how they use and allocate the resources. And then those communities also have a tendency to attend to psychosocial issues and supports. They know the importance of that for their citizenry, and they pay attention to that. So communication, public health and administrative officials need to be well-versed in risk communication and have cultural competency. It's not a one-size-fits-all. As we're looking at the particular concerns regarding the coronavirus, there are some regions and some locations that are more at risk depending on the population, depending on the infrastructure at hand, and that needs to be taken into consideration with our communication. So as I mentioned, to be able to engage our citizens, there needs to be trust, and everything else falls upon that. And so there are the facts that need to be brought forward, and then tempering that with people's fear and talking about what is concerning realistically, what is not concerning, what are rumors, what are facts, etc. And leadership and management can have a considerable impact on the well-being of the citizens, depending on how that's managed. So this is just a reminder, and most of us can appreciate this. Messages in terms of risk communication tend to be just very brief and factual, short, repetitious. We know that when people are a little bit stressed, that may actually heighten performance. Those of you who have been involved in sports or music or things like that where you've had to perform know that having a little bit of butterflies is not necessarily a bad thing. But in risk communication around disasters, we know that people can get overwhelmed. That's why they talk about, making sure the communication is at maybe the 6th grade level or even 3rd grade level. And it's not because people are uneducated. It's because when people are stressed, they can't retain or fathom necessarily the information that's coming at them. We think about that with digit spans. But the best way to think about this in terms of understanding is, if you've been to a doctor and gotten some news that was not great, or in any situation where you were given bad news, what do you remember after that? Not as much. You're thinking about the news that was just given, you're kind of obsessing, you're worrying. And so that's why communication needs to be very straightforward and not overwhelming. So this is kind of a busy slide, but it's a really good, it has really good information. So the Crisis and Emergency Risk Communication Group has these 6 principles, and they're very straightforward, but they're very useful. And some of this came out of my understanding is during 9/11 in New York, there were some experts in risk communication that essentially said, be first, be right, be credible. And so you want to be out there, leaders need to be out there with information that is accurate. And so you also need to be right. You need to be credible. You need to be trustworthy. And you need to be able to be trustworthy, and having laid the groundwork of that is really important. Expressing empathy, ensuring the people that you're talking with, that you understand and you're aware of what they're going through. And most people who have had an experience of trauma, they're pretty good at picking up whether a person's genuine or not as that's being told to them. I talked about the importance of doing something, being active, and then leadership also needs to show respect. And on the other slide, the pitfalls to avoid: mixed messages from multiple experts, information released late, paternalistic attitudes, we know best and we're not going to listen to your concerns, not countering rumors in real time. We know that conspiracy theories and those sorts of myths spread very easily when there's not a counter to that early on. And then not having public power struggles and confusion. So that's why you'll see, and we'll have a slide in a little bit about the template that's used in crisis communication, because we know that it's very easy for people to start pointing fingers even higher at the top. But if there's a template that's followed, everyone knows their rules, their lines within a disaster situation, it goes much more smoothly. So there was a person involved in risk communication, Peter Sandman, who has talked about, risk equal hazard plus outrage. And essentially, if you look up at the upper left, when people are really upset, but there's not a lot to be upset about, the role is to really inform people and bring that outrage down, versus the other side, when it's high and hazardous, we want people to know the concern, but to be able to manage and follow through. And so Sandman talks about looking for the sweet spot. So it's really leadership's job to see, are people paying attention? Do they get it? Is the information that we're giving them accurate? And are they responding in what would seem to be an appropriate fashion? Versus, are things just running amok and people don't understand what the concerns are or how to manage that. And so that's the importance of risk communication. So as we know, people vicariously rehearse. So if they know that something is coming, whether it's a flood or fires or a pandemic, initially we go, well, it's not us, somebody else. And then we go, oh, well, this could be us. And then they oftentimes will have some panic. And so it's really important for leadership to be stepping in and anticipating that and giving direction and things like, here's what you must do, here's what you should do, here's what you can do, and being very clear about that. So the CDC has looked at the response and the impact on individuals. And again, if we're thinking about natural disasters, or a particular circumstance, let's say a fire. There are the individual victims, and then there are those right around them who are impacted. There are the people that are stepping in to assist, the rescue workers, medical care workers, family members. Oftentimes there may be other groups like National Guard or someone else. Then there are the vulnerable populations and impacted businesses around them. And then there's the population in general. With this pandemic, we're seeing all levels potentially being impacted more directly. But we have to keep this in mind in terms of the various populations that are impacted and how and when. Very busy slide. I just wanted to have this included for those who are in leadership. It essentially elaborates on the previous slide from crisis and emergency risk communication. So I'm not going to spend time on this, but I just wanted to embed this in the presentation so that you would have it. So the predictors of people's response and communities' response in terms of resilience oftentimes does matter depending on what the disaster or the risk is. We know that for individuals, man-made disasters, even though they're very difficult, troublesome, there can be significant loss. Oftentimes those are more palatable, they're more understandable and forgivable than man-made disasters, person-made disasters. But oftentimes those are combined. So it's rare that we have a natural disaster that doesn't have some element, obviously, of person-made concerns. How did administration deal with this? How did other countries deal with this? Were there things that could have been done earlier or in the meantime that would have mitigated some of this? So if we go back to that Myers and Zinn picture of the heroic and the disillusionment, et cetera, oftentimes that disillusionment comes when people are questioning leadership's role. Developing and developed countries, oftentimes this actually has to do with resources. As we know, for pandemics like Ebola in Africa, oftentimes there were significant concerns in terms of availability resources. And nonetheless, with assistance, they were able to manage that. But many times when disasters hit, if we think about major earthquakes in a developed country versus a developing country, the impact can be quite different. And then, who is exposed to this disaster or this event? And what was the severity? What was the history? People who have had significant loss, oftentimes that's a particular risk factor for depression. People who have had significant trauma, that can be certainly a predictor for anxiety issues, et cetera. And those aren't mutually exclusive. Also predictors, and I'll be talking about this quite a bit, is social connectedness. And social connectedness is one of the protective factors in terms of resilience. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the other, which has also to do with developing versus developed countries, what are the resources available? Mitrov had quoted, one of the worst outcomes of a crisis is the collapse of fundamental assumptions about the world. And so for many situations, this can be literally earth-shattering. And so it's important to keep things in perspective. It's important to know what the facts are and to have that, I guess, sweet spot of understanding the risks and concerns, but also understanding what can be done, what can be helpful in terms of response, not only within leadership, but within our communities and individually. When I was a child, one of my favorite books was the Sneetches. And, I think this is a good illustration of fairness. So in situations like this, in pandemics, or in other circumstances where there may be limited resources or resources need to be allocated in particular areas, it's really important in terms of communication that the citizens understand why. And again, if there's trust, people can tolerate quite a bit if they know that things are fair. And that's why it's very important for leadership to be able to articulate, if medications become available, they will probably need to be prioritized, and who should get those and why. And so again, it's really important that leadership articulate, what is going on, what is the best decision based on the population at hand. Again, risk communication, very important. So we know that typical signs of stress in disasters, people get irritable, moody, they have significant problems sleeping, anxious, negative ruminations, trouble concentrating. All of those things are typical signs of stress, regardless of what the stress is. In disasters, we also tend to see, more formal diagnoses of anxiety disorders, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and interface with law enforcement because of some of those behaviors due to excessive substance use, domestic violence. This is how stress occurs. My lights just went off, but I won't be concerned about it. So we can anticipate that these sorts of things can happen. And part of our discussion here today is, how do we prepare for this and help people to manage that? So we know that taking care of physical and mental health during disasters is important. If we look away from pandemics and actually the disaster itself, which is going to cause physical problems, if we look at things like floods or hurricanes or earthquakes where people aren't physically injured necessarily, but interestingly, the death rate goes up regardless, and it may be a combination of that stress. We know that with prolonged stress, there's heightened cortisol levels, pro-inflammatory sorts of problems. But also, anyone with chronic disease has more difficulty managing, and it may be resources. Can you get to the clinic? Can you get your medications? Those sorts of things. So when I mentioned before the template of crisis management, every government knows these incident command paradigms. And so you will hear more about this. If you're not aware of this within your own entity, your government and different government layers will have these command systems where they have someone who's designated in command, someone who's managing operations, logistics, planning, administration, finance, public information officer. These are all really well-defined roles, and that helps a lot during a crisis situation like this. So the other thing that you should do, certainly, is look at your own disaster plan. So just yesterday, I was going over with our staff, what are the sorts of things that we need to have in place if they're not already, our decision trees, our phone trees, do we have access to our drives to be able to do work outside of the office? Do we have our computers set up so we can access those? Do we have that sort of information that we need? And so part of that, I'm sure that you've already been involved in both, locally, but also just so you're aware, we have that incident command. So we also know that regardless of the circumstances, workforce absenteeism occurs. In our current situation, there are discussions about mandates of, no, we don't want you coming into work because of this risk in terms of pandemics. But even without pandemics, there's a significant amount of absenteeism that occurs for many different reasons. And so as part of our preparedness, individually within our own entities, we need to be aware of how deep we are and what are essential sorts of functions. And so we have seen, hoarding behaviors. Part of that, there's the concept of loss aversion. Something's happening, we don't want to miss out, and therefore we're going to follow and do whatever. But the problem is with hoarding behaviors, people should have had some preparation regardless for any sort of event. And when there are hoarding behaviors, and there are peak symptoms that occur, then we have more problems with resources. And particularly healthcare providers or others may have more problems with resources. So it's really important for communication and leadership to help people understand, where are things at right now? What is it that you likely will need? One of the dilemmas that we deal with is the just-in-time economy, and we've been experiencing that. So many years ago, we switched from, having warehouses and stockpiles to being able to just order online, and in 2 days or 3 days from wherever, whatever we wanted or needed arrived. And obviously disasters, and particularly pandemics, will disrupt that. And we've certainly experienced that and seen that. So what we want to think about is what can be done from home. Will communication tools be available? So we make assumptions. The good news is in pandemics, as opposed to natural disasters, it would be pretty unusual for our communication infrastructures to drop. It would be pretty unusual for our basic needs like electricity and fuel to be disrupted. But depending on the just-in-time economy, there are some circumstances that can be problematic. Who provides what service, what function, essentially, again, what is essential? So just definitions: social distancing, quarantine, and isolation. Isolation is that we're separating a person who's been, found to be sick. Quarantine is often confused for that, but quarantine is actually separating someone who we feel is probably still well, probably not infected, but they have been exposed. So they have been separated because they've been exposed. And then social distancing is what communities are doing now. Sports arenas, they're saying you're going to, play in front of an empty, empty crowd, empty arena, or not play at all. Potential impacts on mental health. We just said that social connectedness is a significant factor in maintaining resilience. And so we're talking about disrupting social connectedness. And so how do we manage that? How do we prepare for that? As I mentioned, it would be unlikely that communications and electricity and those sorts of things would be disrupted. We might have access still to internet and therefore video conferencing with friends, family, etc. But we need to keep that in mind. How are we going to maintain social connectedness? How are we going to be prepared? And we also know that social media itself can have a plus and a minus as far as mental health. There are some people that are actually not as socially connected emotionally, but they are on social media, and we've talked at length as a society on the potential downside of people just being on their cell phones or being on social media and not really truly interacting with each other in a genuine way. And so, as we talked about in terms of fairness, leadership communication is really important on the justification. We've already started doing social distancing. If there's justification for quarantine, why is that? What supports are available? Those of you who are providers have been working on how do we provide care to individuals, who may be at risk, or do we limit our outreach? Do we limit them coming in? If so, then how do we communicate with them? Some people are doing video conferencing, telemedicine, telebehavioral health. So individual resilience and community resilience, it makes sense that an individual being resilient can help a community being resilient and vice versa. A lot of the studies haven't been done on the relationship between individual resilience and community resilience. There's some, but one would think that it does flow both ways, and I think that's very common sense, that resilient individuals lead to resilient communities and vice versa. Those of you who are care providers know that there's a risk. There's a risk I'm sure that slide on stress, most of you could identify with that. I know many of my colleagues could identify with that right now. Life goes on. So all of the other sorts of things that occur in one's daily life, there are illnesses, there are deaths, there are joyful events, there are births, there are weddings, but all of those things are going on while we're dealing with this. And so it's obviously important to be managing, to be, taking care of the caretakers. I have a colleague who is a trainer for the Red Cross as a psychologist. And whenever she went out on a Red Cross mission, she always tagged one of her colleagues to keep an eye on her, just to help her and make sure that if that person sees that she is struggling, that she would be aware of it. Because oftentimes we're the last people to actually be paying attention and taking care of ourselves. So it's just very important that we do that. Some of the ways that we can mitigate burnout is reminding us of why we're doing what we're doing. When we've looked at, and much of the work that I've done and studied has been in physician burnout, but oftentimes one of the main factors is separating from the original reason why you went into the business, why you went into the career, into the calling. And so oftentimes it's helpful when we have a little bit of a positive situation where we go, yeah, this is actually why I signed up. This is a reminder of why I'm doing what I'm doing. So it's easy to lose that in a disaster or in a crisis situation. It's good to find those reminders. So this is from IASC. We know, starting at the bottom, basic services, security, community and family supports are necessary for behavioral health. Those who have been directly traumatized or impacted, there can be focused but non-specialized supports, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and then specialized services, and I'll show you what this means. So and this is a bit separate from pandemics, but when there are major disasters, we want to be mindful about what the evidence says in terms of helping the populations. So for general populations that are experiencing, disaster situations, we don't do critical incident debriefing. And so let's say, for example, that there are major fires and a group of firefighters were severely impacted. And then there were other individuals who lost their homes, et cetera. We wouldn't do critical incident debriefing for the individuals who lost their home, et cetera. Critical incident debriefing is oftentimes for very close-knit groups, such as law enforcement, firefighters, first responders, military, et cetera. That's a very specialized sort of population. But we would consider psychological first aid, other supportive engagement. We really want to normalize the process. When I was talking with an individual who had been involved in the earthquakes in Christchurch, New Zealand, one of the people said, I don't need a shrink, I need a contractor. I need something specific and practical to move on. And so we want to be mindful of that as well. So myths about disasters and resilience. So myth number one is the majority of those affected will develop PTSD or depression. That's not true. I mean, certainly there are risks for acute stress disorders early on. And people who are quarantined, particularly against their will, and others, they may be at higher risk. But the majority of people who are involved in a disaster situation actually, don't develop pathology. So it's a normal response to an abnormal situation most often. But as people in the field working in behavioral health, we also need to be mindful about how to identify those people at risk and make sure that they're getting the help they need. Another myth is resilience is an inherent trait, can't be taught. Actually, it can be. There are things that we've just talked about and we'll be talking about that can be useful. And the other is all disasters result in long-term negative outcomes. You've heard the term, I'm sure, about post-traumatic growth. There's some people who talk about transformational resilience. When we talked about community resilience, part of the things that we were talking about was being active, being, not being passive. And so there are opportunities there actually for growth. So this is kind of a busy slide, but so when governments look at disaster situations, and I'm not, talking specifically for pandemics, but psychological first aid, which is essentially look, listen, and link people to the help that they need, whether it's behavioral, whether it's cleaning supplies, et cetera. Then there's crisis counseling, which oftentimes comes with government grants after a crisis. And those are, community-based outreach, psychoeducation, and those are time limited. And then there's the specialized group, as I mentioned, critical incident stress debriefing for, special populations. But who provides that? So psychological first aid, trained lay people or mental health professionals. And, we help the general population, who have been impacted. So it's primarily supportive. Crisis counseling, a bit more expertise, trained paraprofessionals and mental health professionals, and assisting individuals and communities in recovery. A little bit more intentional. And then, as mentioned, critical incident stress debriefing, and you need to know what you're doing to provide that. Protocols for psychological first aid is primarily safety, calmness, connectedness, self-efficacy. Outreach, same with crisis counseling. Oftentimes it's outreach, people going out, checking on people who have been impacted, mitigating, further emotional damage, etc. So, doing what we can in terms of reducing our vulnerability helps in terms of our resiliency, both individually and from a community standpoint. Resilient attitudes, this is the cognitive, behavioral approach to things, viewing change as a challenge or opportunity while being realistic, setting goals, planning action steps that are also realistic, sometimes just one goal, one step, one positive at a time. In the midst of a crisis, we talk about rest, routine, and relationships, making sure that you're getting adequate sleep. If you can maintain some semblance of routine despite this upheaval, that can be really reassuring. We know that rites and rituals, routines are very soothing for people. And then maintaining those relationships, that connectedness as best we can. So of all the variables, two of the most impactful in terms of resilience have to do with resources and social connectedness. And as mentioned, if there's an issue regarding social distancing and connecting, that may have an impact on people. Quarantine may have an impact on people. I'm looking at my Kindle. Do I have my books downloaded? Do I have things at home that would keep me occupied? I have my laptop ready. Every day I take my laptop home. It's linked to what I need on the drives. So that's part of my planning. Many years ago, more than a decade ago, during one of our floods, a group of us developed a resilience group, and it came out of the faith-based community as well as the mental health community, governments, and we called ourselves Red River Resilience. I think the website's still up. There are some pamphlets there. But we took the evidence-based material that was out there and used this acronym called FACTS, and essentially for resilience. And it's to foster hope, trying to avoid negativity. Act with purpose, continuing to do something productive, not necessarily just busy work, but actually, something with goals and something that we can do. And as I mentioned, leadership can, certainly help communities in that, connecting with others, that social connectedness. And I said, don't emotionally isolate. So some people may be forced to isolate, but it's not, don't emotionally isolate, try to be in touch with others, despite not being there face to face, or at least in person. The basics of taking care of yourselves, and then search for meaning. And this isn't necessarily a spiritual sort of thing, but it's how do I make sense of this? For some people it is spiritual. For other people it's simply, what is it about this that that is impacting my life, and what can I do about it? And how can I grow from this? And so, we've gone through many things as individuals, and so we need to remind ourselves, what do we know? What don't we know? For what we know, we can be confident in our competence, know your strengths and weaknesses. For those of you who are overseeing others, we have to keep an eye on the resources, and as well as the wellness of our staff and our family, know their situations. That's not only important in terms of empathy and support, but also for the organization that you're working with. And providers, networking, oftentimes this is an opportunity to build networks, and the next time around, the next concern that occurs, you will be surprised at how you can use those built-in networks to spread this out for other purposes. Those of you who have expertise, be available as you can. Not all leadership knows what impacts there are going to be on behavioral health, which is why we're having this conversation. So if you have availability and expertise, you can lean in, but ultimately you need to take care of yourself so that you can assist others. I mentioned the earthquakes in New Zealand. A colleague of mine, Alistair Humphreys, had this slide on built environment, and social environment, natural environment. I thought this was really useful, not just from a mental health standpoint, but from a community standpoint as a whole. And clearly, as we're hearing government right now, they're trying to address all of these areas. So to recap, people need leaders who know how to communicate. Reducing stress in the population is protective. There's a lot of noise out there. When I was in leadership in our state government, I was surprised at how our state providers, may have a different message than the CDC, which may have a different message than somewhere else. So pay attention to the experts. Social connectedness, we talked about. Individuals and communities can experience positive outcomes despite disasters, but we need to obviously be realistic. David, do you want to take this over?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Dr. McLean. That was very, very informative.